Okay, ladies and gentlemen, it's like 2:03. As you know, I like to keep a tight ship when it comes to time. So it gives me great pleasure to be able to introduce Professor Renee Luthra. She's a sociology with renowned expertise in international migration, social stratification, education, and quantitative methods. Her current research interests include migration and inequalities in parenting, education, work, and health. And she has published extensively in prestigious journals like Demography, International Migration and Review, Ethnic and Relation Studies, and the European Sociological Review. She's a professor in the Department of Sociology and Criminology at the University of Essex. She's the director of the Essex Center for Migration Studies and deputy director of the ESRC Research Center on Microsocial Change. And this year she's visiting both Cornell and Colgate. So on a more personal note, Professor Luthra and I got our PhDs. We defended within 12 hours of each other. She did it in the afternoon the day before, I did it in the morning afterwards. Our committee members were almost very similar. We had one difference. You had Don Feynman and I had Judy Seltzer. Without further ado, here is Professor Luthra.
Thank you for that nice introduction, and thank you guys for coming. It's really a pleasure to be here. I got to drive. I never get to drive to events, so it's really great. So I'm going to be talking about sort of a wider body of work, and this is work that I'm doing with collaborators. Alessandra Ferrara is at the Wissenschaftszentrum Berlin, the Social Science Research Center Berlin, and my colleague Lucinda Platz at LSE. And so this is, so we're trying to understand immigrant outcomes while recognizing that they come from a very unequal world. So just to kind of motivate, I probably don't need to do this in this audience, but obviously the general rhetoric around migration at the moment is quite negative. So the UK's, bragging, even though we have a Labour government in power right now, bragging about deporting people more quickly. Americans are being protected against invaders. The German Interior Minister says that now the Syrian war is drawing to a close. They're actually going to try and repatriate or send back refugees who've arrived there. I'm going to be talking about Germany, that's why I've got that in there. And then, of course, in your own country, this was in February, I think, record high levels of deportation and sort of very anti-immigrant rhetoric going on in the news today. So I want to talk about a more positive side of things, which is the fact that immigrants tend to be selected, and they tend to be selected on a lot of the things that we actually care about and benefit receiving societies. So on the other side of the spectrum, this is a recent Financial Times article, Anglosphere countries like the UK, Canada, and the United States, generally speaking, have more highly skilled immigrants, who are more highly skilled than the native population, and also children who tend to do better in school. Immigrants tend to be healthier and to live longer than residents in many host countries. Immigrants actually cost the healthcare system less than US-born Americans, and this is true in many countries as well. And this is, again, the Canadian angle. Immigrants admitted to Canada as children have better education and work outcomes than native Canadian citizens. So there's both sides. There's an anti-immigrant sentiment, but sort of also a recognition that immigrants benefit. But they don't all benefit the same. So they don't all have the same outcomes. So the puzzle that we're going to try to explain today is sort of unexplained variation in immigrant and second generation outcomes. So when we have foreign-born in a general model of educational attainment or health, they often tend to do better or do worse than we would expect given things that we can usually observe about them. And that's a puzzle in many literatures. One potential solution for this is the idea that immigrants are selected in usually unobserved ways, so essentially omitted variable bias. There's something different about them that we can't see, and that's why they do better or worse in receiving countries. So I'm going to talk about how we actually try to assess this hypothesis, because it is very much a hypothesis. And we're going to be looking at educational selection, selectivity in education, and how that might influence immigrants' labor market performance, but also the educational attainment of their children. Then we're going to turn to health, and we're going to look at, well, how could maybe selection in health, first of all, how can we measure it? And second of all, how can we actually see whether or not it explains differences, unexplained differences in the health of immigrants from different backgrounds and also between natives and immigrants. And I'll kind of conclude with whether or not selection solves this puzzle or not and talk a little bit about next steps. And I'm keen to hear your thoughts because some of this work is published, but a lot of it's not. So it will be nice to hear what you have to think. So Kate mentioned that we had Don Tryman as our supervisor, and anyone who's been trained at UCLA knows a lot about this basic Blau and Duncan's status attainment model. So this is the sort of basic social stratification model that we use. You know, we know that a parent or an adult's occupational status is oftentimes largely a function of their own education. These two things together influence the education of their kids, which then goes on to influence the occupational attainment of their children, sort of everything together. But standard stratification models don't fit as well for immigrants and their families. So on one hand, we have substantial unexplained variation in labor market outcomes for the foreign-born, even if we control for the usual suspects like their education, their age, etc. And here's just a handful of older papers which have demonstrated this in the UK context, but also throughout Europe. There's also substantial unexplained variation in the educational attainment for the children of immigrants. So these are more recent papers, some of which my co-authors have contributed to. Basically, if you look at parents' occupation and education, it has a much weaker relationship with the kids' educational attainment in immigrant families. And this is work that I've been kind of doing myself for a long time. So this is results from Germany, this is results from the UK, and this is results from the United States. Now, don't boggle your mind with bars. The whole point of showing you the bars is basically, this is just showing you that after we control for parents' occupational status and parents' educational attainment, you see these big differences in education amongst immigrants of different origin groups. So there's a lot of variation that we're not explaining with standard stratification models. And that's true, again, in the German context where we're trying to predict the probability of upper track secondary attainment. It's true in the UK when we're just measuring like where you are in the educational distribution of the UK. And it's true in the United States when we're looking at years education. So again, this is like a finding that we really come against over and over again. So that's like one puzzle that maybe selection could be helpful in understanding. The other puzzle is this idea of migration and health inequalities. So this is just a stylized picture of what happens with something that we see in a lot of receiving contexts with immigrant groups. We tend to see that immigrants, the red, are often healthier. So here we have self-reported health, but it could be a lot of things, morbidity, it could be diabetes, it could be all kinds of things. They often have better health when they initially arrive in the receiving country. So this is often called the healthy immigrant effect. Again, it's seen in a lot of contexts. But they also tend to, not always, but sometimes have more quickly deteriorating health over time, such that the gap tends to close. And then this is called the immigrant health paradox because it is paradoxical that usually the longer that you spend in a receiving country, you acquire the language, maybe you get a better job, maybe you start to learn the healthcare system and you access healthcare. So it's weird that your health would get worse relative to natives as time goes by. And so there's a lot of work done on this in the United States, but increasingly we're seeing it, again, also in the European context as well. So basically, there's unexplained variation here in health at onset and also in trajectories over time. So how might we account for some of these unexplained advantages in trajectories? So there's a lot of existing explanations for variation, which I'm not going to have time to talk about today because I'm focusing on one, but I'm happy to chat about in the Q&A. There's a lot of research that shows that immigrants have high levels of ethnic solidarity that can improve their mental health, that can help them access resources. We know that there's variation in terms of the immigrants' legal status. So some immigrants have more preferential treatment than others, or rather, preferential is maybe the wrong word. Some immigrants have much worse treatment than other immigrants do. That might be, and that's often not observed in standard data, so that could be underlying some of this variation. There could be positive or negative discrimination against specific groups. It could also be going on. But today we're going to focus on this idea of immigrant selectivity. The main point of this, sort of the main observation of this hypothesis is that immigrants are systematically different from non-migrants. They are selected, they are different, on usually unobserved traits that matter for things like health, education, and the labor market. So some of the traits that we might expect to matter are things like, when we think about especially education, but also occupational attainment, your aspirations, your expectations for yourself and your children. You know, you could have higher ones. So we know that this has actually been documented qualitatively, but also quantitatively. You may have social capital. This is that ethnic solidarity that we're talking about. So maybe you come with higher numbers of connections that you can make through co-ethnics or through some other means. We might not actually observe accurately the class status that you had in the sending country. So it may be that, here, the classic story, here you're driving a taxi cab, but back home you were a doctor. Well, if I ask you in a survey, what are you doing now? I'll see that you're a taxi cab driver. I won't see that, your parents were doctors in the home country, right? So I might not actually be observing class habitus selection as well. There may be some selection on cognitive and non-cognitive skills, and so there has been a little bit of work, especially with non-cognitive skills and values, that shows that immigrants tend to be more open. They tend to be more liberal than the people that they leave behind. Again, not universally, these are just sort of like broad stroke descriptions. And also, migration is costly, is painful, or rather physically demanding, and so you may also be positively selected on health. However, there's variation in this at the individual level. Some immigrants may be more or less positively selected than others, and also at the group level as well. So the direction and the degree of selection can help us potentially explain some unexplained variation. Between immigrants and natives, which the health paradox is often about immigrants and natives, but also amongst the foreign-born and their children, so also amongst people of different origins themselves, and also themselves and their kids. So just to kind of show you, I just wanted to cite some of the people that basically say that these things are socially stratified. So we know that aspirations and expectations reflect social class in the sending country, that social capital is also socially stratified in many places. People who have higher SES tend to have bigger and more diverse social networks. That's true in the UK, that's also true in many countries. Class habitus, cognitive and non-cognitive skills, and health. So all of these things we can kind of picture as like falling on some kind of ladder. And so what we want is we want to find the ladder in the sending country and put the immigrant in the ladder in the sending country, not where they may be in Canada, but where they were on this ladder at home. So if that's true, if it's true that we're not observing where they are on this ladder, that this ladder leads to these things, then unexplained variation may actually just be unobserved social reproduction. So it looks like they're doing something weird, but they're actually just doing what we would expect given their background at home, not the background as we see it here. So how do we test this? So here I'm drawing on some pretty graphics that Cynthia Feliciano made in her review article from 2020. So we need to measure selection. So we need to find this ladder, this pre-migration location of immigrants and non-migrants, and we need to figure out where the immigrants are here. And this could be health, education, wealth, income, attitude, skills, whatever you're thinking of. Then we want to measure its impact. So we need to follow up. Once we've identified where they are, we need to follow them up post-migration. And so we need to see, okay, in the post-migration context, what are their health, what's their labor market, what's the education of their children in the receiving society. So it's a little bit onerous from a quantitative perspective to actually get data that allows us to deal with this. Some challenges here. So first of all, migrants are usually only observed in destination country surveys. We rarely have pre-migration data on immigrants. And we also need data on non-migrants in their origin countries, and if they come like Canada or the US or the UK, if they come from like 100, got a little crazy there, 100 different countries, 150 different countries, it's not so easy to do. Now, moreover, lots of characteristics are not stable over time. So now the SES of your dad, that's never going to change once you're an adult, right? The SES of your dad from when you were a kid, that's going to stay stable. Some things like that, or like completed education, that stays stable over time, but things like health, or attitudes, or aspirations can change. So I can't ask you now, what was your expectations for yourself as a for your college education when you were 10 and living in your home country, you probably won't remember, or there'll be retrospective bias there, so I can't ask you. So it's hard to measure selection for these two reasons. Moreover, when we observe at origin, so let's say we do a survey of people in their sending countries, then we have that data there, and that's nice. But it's very rare that you actually follow people who leave the country later, and that's the beauty of like the MXFLS, like the Mexican Family Life Survey or the Mexican Migration Project. They were some of the few data sets that actually do this, but though I think there's really just a handful. And if someone knows of some, though, let me know in the Q&A. But those are like the only two that I'm actually aware of. And because of that, it's really hard to test the selection effect, because we can't see what you eventually go on to do in the receiving country. So despite this is a popular hypothesis, actual evidence is kind of scarce about how it actually plays out. So what's the solution? Our solution, but not just us, other people were drawing on the work of others, is to locate immigrants with some kind of internationally standardized distribution for the whole world by cohort, sex, and country. And so we're doing this in 3 different ways, and I'm going to talk about the first 2 today. The third one is still a work in progress. So we're going to be looking at relative education as a sort of catch-all measure of class status or habitus from the sending country. We're going to look at relative height, again, as a sort of catch-all, as a measure of your health selection, exposure to childhood health outcomes, et cetera, from the sending country. And then we're going to look at your relative generalized trust as a measure of values. The reason why this one's still a work in progress is that that's something that can change over time. So we're still trying to get a way of dealing with that. Okay, so let's start with relative education. So in empirical work, like with the Blau and Duncan model, social stratification is often proxied with parental education. It's, if your parent is highly educated, we assume all kinds of things about you that actually don't have anything to do with education per se, but it's meant to be a proxy. But the problem is that parental education is not internationally invariant measure of social positioning. So, yeah, I'll kind of show you more what I mean. This is like United States, Canada, right? If I have an upper secondary degree, I'm not that positively selected. I'm only more educated than maybe 15% of the people in the population. In a country like this, I might be more educated than, say, 50%. I'd be like the median level. And then in some countries, like many countries that send immigrants to the UK, for instance, with an upper secondary degree, I'd already be quite positively selected. I would be fairly rare. So we need a way of adjusting absolute measures for relative ones. And so what do? You guys have maybe seen the ITCHU paper. You've seen Cynthia Feliciano. Other people have used this data set. So we're using the Barrow-Lee data set, which somebody else has done this gorgeous work of basically getting educational distributions of educational attainment for adults by sex for 146 different countries for all of these different observation years. And what we do is we take the immigrant in the UK or in Canada and we match them to the distribution in the sending country. So just to kind of give you an example, I'm Renee. I was born in 1981. I'm tertiary educated. I migrated to the UK in 2010. This is the proportion of the American population that had all of these different educational characteristics for my birth cohort and my sex. And basically, I add these up and I subtract half of the level that I'm at. And then you can see that I'm more educated than 82% of Americans. Yay! So I'm positively selected in this respect. Now you can see that obviously that there's some shortcomings here because I have a PhD, so I'm probably more than 82. I am more than 82%. So it's a measure that has noise in it, but it's nevertheless a measure. So there's already been some work that links relative education to immigrant outcomes, but it's quite mixed actually. So when we look at the labor market, at least in Europe, we often don't see any positive association net of absolute levels for immigrant selection and labor market outcomes. It's kind of mixed. When we look at aspirations, though, it's consistently positive. When we look at family mobility strategy, so how much your parents maybe pressure you or expect of you, it's consistently positive. For school choice, it tends to be positive. For educational attainment, there's mixed results in Europe. So increasingly papers are finding that despite the fact that kids whose parents are positively selected have high aspirations for themselves, they're often lower absolute levels of education means that it's hard for them to actually help the kids in school. So they might aspire, they might even go to upper secondary tracks, but they're more likely to drop out. So that's something that we're kind of getting more of a feeling about. So I'm kind of contributing to this general literature here. So we're going to do an empirical assessment, 2 different papers. One, we're looking at immigrant labor market, and here we're just trying to see, does my own degree of selection, educational selection, have an impact on my employment, my wages, or my occupational status over and above my absolute level of education and sort of the usual suspects? And then we're also interested to see whether or not the children of immigrants benefit from parents being more positively selected. Again, net of the usual things. And so here we're going to be looking at, here we're looking at adults, here we're looking at kids who are 10 to 15 years old in our data, and also adults, children of immigrants, 25 to 50. These numbers are a lot bigger than these because we can combine more survey years for the latter ones. I should also say that when I'm talking, this is going to be true throughout the talk, when I'm talking about first gen, I'm talking about people who migrated after the age of 18. Second gen is those who came to the UK or came to Germany before 25 years old, or before 5 years old rather, or were born there. And third gen is a sort of heterogeneous population of people whose grandparents were born in born in the receiving country. So let's just start with like, what's the variation that we're actually seeking to explain here? So in the UK, these are immigrant native gaps in labor market outcomes for adults 25 to 65. This is the raw gap, just like not adjusting for things. And then this is adjusting for age and education and region where you're living. And so what you see is that immigrants are less likely to be in work, but these are fairly small. So this is percentage points, okay? So you are about like 7 percentage points less likely to be in work than native British people or people who are not immigrants in the UK. Once we adjust for education and other things, that's smaller, but it's still there. Once you get into work, though, you tend to have slightly higher wages, but you're less likely to be in a professional job. So this is like, there's some variation that's left over when we kind of control for the normal things. And it's a mixed story. It's kind of mostly negative. This is sort of a little bit positive. This is like logged percentage points, so it's like around 5% higher wages. When we look at second generation education, so you can see this is the third generation. This is the 1.5 in second, and then this is the 1.5 in second after we control for the level of education the parent had. Yes?
Can I ask, like in the previous graph, isn't adjusted for occupation?
No. Thanks, that's a good question. Yeah, and please do feel free, obviously. So here you can see higher educational attainment both before and after we control for the parents' education. So again, kids are doing better, adults doing slightly worse on average. Now let's just measure first. So in the UK, are immigrants selected? Yes, and so we were curious to see if this change has changed in any way over time, because obviously the UK has had really different migration policies over time, but it's pretty consistent. So like, on average, an immigrant is more educated than 80% of the sending country population on average, and that has stayed quite consistent over time. So starting in 1945, obviously when the data is really quite sparse, all the way to 2015, you have high selection. And actually, I should probably have put extra slides, and so I have more slides that also with the labor force survey where you can see this change. But what's going on is that there's a mixture of sending countries are becoming more educated over time. So like at this time, for a lot of the sending countries, you could have really low education, but still be more educated than 80%. And then more recently, the UK, like many other countries, has made it really hard to come if you don't basically have like a tertiary degree, unless you're coming as a family reunification. If you're coming for work, you have to be quite educated. So that's what's going on here. And I also wanted to show you that within absolute educational categories, right? Primary or less, some secondary, into tertiary, you have quite a bit of variation in terms of relative education within these. This is that omitted variable bias. If it was just perfectly matched on, it wouldn't matter. But obviously, especially for some secondary and completing secondary, you have quite a bit of differences because of the sort of very unequal world we're talking about. Okay, so let's actually, so that the first step, let's just measure it. The second, let's see its effects, okay? So here, this is the association between educational selection and labor market outcomes, controlling for, now we have a bigger suite of controls, absolute education, where you live, your age, your labor market experience, whether or not you were educated in the UK, like your final degrees in the UK, your marital status, and the number of children at home. And what you see here is for women and for men, you don't see a lot of bars above zero. It's actually not doing much. It's not explaining much extra variation really at all. And in fact, for men, if you're more positively selected, you're slightly, but again, also, sorry, look at the y-axis, little, not much going on. This is, I think, statistically significant, but none of the other stuff is. So we were sad, I'm not gonna lie. Then we thought, well, let's look at the mediators though. So maybe, you know, maybe the labor market's not rewarding the characteristics though that we would expect to be associated, right? So just look at this. This is just basically bivariate correlations. And all of you know, probably, who've taken statistics, these are not big numbers. These are really small numbers. So actually, educational selection is weakly correlated with cognitive, verbal, and mathematical ability, but pretty weak. It's very weakly or not at all correlated with the big 5 personality traits. And it's quite weakly correlated with health. So that's probably part of why we're not seeing much, is because the stuff that should lead to better labor market outcomes actually isn't. Now, we think some of this might be that like there's quite uniformly high selection in this sample, but again, like I showed you, it's not like everybody's at the 90th percentile. It's not like there's no variation to explain. So in the end, it's just, this is just what it is. Well, what about their kids? Maybe they're not. Maybe it's not doing much for them, but maybe it's doing something for their children. So we looked at that then in the second part of the analysis. So here we've got educational attitudes of the youth, the 10 to 15-year-olds. So now we see this is the association between parents' relative education and a variety of models where we just have basic controls. We control for absolute education, we control for the parent's occupation, the region of origin of the parent, and the arrival cohort of the parent. And basically what you see here is the controls are not actually doing a whole lot. The main thing is if your parent is more high up on the semi-country distribution, you're more likely to expect university, and you're less likely to expect to be working at age 16. You're also more likely to expect an upper class occupation, but that's mostly explained by origin and arrival cohort. You're not necessarily doing much more. You're not necessarily studying a lot more or less likely to ditch school, but you do have higher expectations. So there we do see this kind of class habitus thing. But what about the actual attainment? Like I said, other papers have shown that then attainment's not really associated that much with the selection story. So here, this is the relative education, so where you are on the distribution amongst people your age, amongst these adults, the adult children of immigrants. And the blue is just the basic model without educational selection, and the red is after educational selection. And you can basically see that like it's not explaining anything at all. And again, this is different than like the really well-cited Feliciano paper, for instance, that does find that it explains a little bit. In the UK context, at least for this cohort, it's not. And so to me, this is saying that we need to do more work on this, because obviously it varies across place and time. So, okay, what do we learn from this? Selection has a null or even a negative association with labor market outcomes in the UK. Selection has a null or association with some of these mechanisms that we think might actually link the two. It has a positive association with expectations, but not effort or attainment of the second generation. And so in the UK context, at least, consistently high selection leads to high expectations, but it's little added value. So, yeah, that's my tale. Looking forward to hearing what you have to say about it. Now, let's look at health, because this is obviously a different type of pattern. And for this, we're going to a completely different country. I'm now taking you to Germany, just because this is where I have better data and a collaborator who works with it. So now we wanted to see, okay, what about selection and health? So most studies do observe post-migration health, and they assume that because immigrants are healthier, because we have this healthy immigrant effect, that, well, they just must be positively selected. But they don't actually measure that. And some observe health on arrival, but then they don't actually measure in selection, and they don't measure its effects. Papers that do manage to tie the two together tend to get sort of mixed results, and this is mostly papers from the US context. And then there's some evidence, because obviously when you have internal migration, then the problem is solved, because you can observe people as they move within a country, and that's easier. And there we tend to see that migrants do tend to be healthier on average than the people they left behind. But again, how that translates in an international context, we're not always so sure. So here, our solution is to use height selection. So your height, once you become an adult, is a mix of your genetic endowment, but also the environment you were exposed to as a child. And that environment that you were exposed to as a child is socially stratified in a similar way as maybe education is. So some kids have good nutrition, mom doesn't smoke, etc. Other kids don't. And we're trying to capitalize on that variation to get an idea of selection on where you come in a sort of health hierarchy. So it's a proxy of childhood health. It's been demonstrated repeatedly to be associated with health outcomes later on in life. These relationships, the relationship between your relative height and your health outcomes, it holds across cohorts and across places. So that, again, that's important if we're trying to think about an unequal world. And again, but we need to contextualize height, because some countries, people are much taller than average, again, just like education. It also has this very nice characteristic that it's actually stable until you start shrinking. We're kind of pushing it with 50. Some people are saying that we start shrinking at 40, but we're pushing it out. And it's not so normally distributed, which is nice. And again, there's some evidence of height selection from the United States. So we use height as a proxy of pre-migration health. So we're taking height on migrants, ages 20 to 50. Then we match this to the origin countries by sex and birth cohort, just like we do for education. We get a Z-score, which again has this nice characteristic, because basically all we need is your sending country mean and standard deviations, because we don't have to have more information than that. Okay, so now this is our bigger project with a couple of RAs and also Alessandro mostly, really. We've been gathering different combined data sets to get heights from across the world. So here's a whole bunch which already have this data sort of gathered together for us, but we're also using a lot of single country data sets to fill in the holes. We're building height distributions by country, sex, and 10-year birth cohorts. Then we are finding immigrants and receiving country data, putting them in the distribution for the measure of relative height. For this paper, we're taking the data set that we've constructed, and we're matching it with the GSOP, the German Socioeconomic Panel from 2014, which is right after they did an immigrant boost. People who migrated after 18, and we have height measurements for these immigrants in the GSOP from between the ages of 18 and 50. If they got measured after 50, we don't use them. And so then we can compute contextual height for these folks. And as far as we know, this is the first time this has actually been done in Europe, or certainly in Germany. So let's measure selection. Again, that's the first part. That's the part we're doing first. So here's women, and here's men, and here's height selectivity. It's not uniformly positive like we saw for education. There's actually quite a bit of variation, and it's much more positive for men than it is for women, which makes sense given the reason for migration that men tend to have. And actually, if you want, I can chat a little bit about the things that predict this, because that's another part of the project too, like what predicts selectivity in height. But basically just to show that there is variation, but on average, there's positive selection on height. And then we want to measure its effects. So here, we're just looking at everybody together, so not stratifying by time since migration, not using panel data, just looking at cross-sectional data. And what you can see is that being taller is associated with better subjective health, better physical health. This is the SF12 survey. They kind of ask you a bunch of questions about your physical health. You're less likely to see the doctor, and you're less likely to have diagnosed conditions. So that's the green bars. No, just raw. It's associated with the things we would think. But that's explained by demographics, by educational attainment, and by the origin region. So once we control for potential confounders, we don't really see any net effect anymore. Once again, we were a little bit sad. But then we decided to look, what about the other part of this paradox, this other health finding, that immigrant health declines over time. And here the results are quite interesting. So what we have here is the green is for people who are in the bottom quartile of health selectivity, height selectivity. The red is for people who are in the top quartile. And here what you see is that it's the green, it's the people who are who are shorter on average for their sending country that are experiencing the health decline. So they're the ones, so here's natives, the dashed bar. They're the ones that are going down and becoming even worse than the native born in terms of subjective health, in terms of physical health. They're more likely to have those health diagnoses, and then they're more likely to have those annual doctor visits. So the trajectory is being explained by selection and health. And in case you were wondering, yes, these are cross-sectional models. The SOAP is nice, it's a panel data set. So this also holds when we look at, it's a smaller sample because we have to have more waves, but when we look at the smaller sample, we see the same results within a person, right? So now we're looking at the same person's trajectory over time. And again, you can see those in the bottom are going down, and in these cases going up, whereas the more positively selected are sort of staying stable over time. So for here, greater height selection is not associated with better health at arrival, and we think that this could be that, to make that initial move, you have to be in decent health. So it's sort of masking and maybe initial variation. Only those with good enough health can migrate. But selection does predict trajectory, so the positively selective have high and stable health, whereas the negatively selective have declining health over time. I'm not going to exhaust you by talking about this, and like I said, these measures are still really messy, but I'm really interested in this because I think this is going to be more about things like attitudes, political participation, and stuff like that. Watch this space. Okay, so what have we learned? We've learned selection matters, and it can help us understand some residual differences between immigrants and natives, but the story is complicated, and the measure needs to be closely tailored to the puzzle. So I'm not to use you guys to preach about stuff, but the educational selectivity is used for lots of stuff because of the Barrowly data set, but we think that actually trying to have measures that are a little bit closer to the things that you're interested in probably makes sense when you're trying to look at selectivity. So education's not going to be associated with everything. Educational selection matters more for expectation than for outcomes. And so some of this could be because of overambitious educational choices, which is for instance, found in the Swedish context. Positively selected tend to send their kids or tend to go to higher educational tracks even when their performance at the primary level is not as high. However, there could also be just differences that immigrants do better in education because there's less discrimination in education than there is in the labor market. And we also find this in the UK context too. Health selection seems to protect immigrants from declining health. I think the mechanisms are still somewhat unknown in most European countries, so we know a lot about the Hispanic health paradox in the US, for instance, but we know less about, in countries where you have universal health care, for instance, or in countries where don't have high rates, say, of obesity or heart disease in the sending country, we might see something different, and we're still doing that work. So does selection solve the puzzle? Again, expectations are stratified, but skills and behaviors less so. Health trajectories are partially explained, but not this initial health advantage. So it's not solving the puzzle, but it's giving us some clues. The Barrowly data is a huge service to the field, and we hope our height and value data sets will be useful resources too, because we'll be making them publicly available soon. Thank you guys for your attention. I look forward to questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Luthra. This is really interesting. I kind of wanted to bug you on that last point that you didn't get into concerning the values and political participation. Could you speak a little bit about that at all? Anything off the top of your head, or what you've started to see when you get those comparisons?
Yeah, so in 2019 you wrote a paper on this, but only looking with South Asian populations because that's where we had the generalized trust measures for. And it was real. What I thought was most interesting about that work, but again, this is like all off the record, right? Because we need to clean everything. But like, was that so in many immigrant sending countries, education is not positively associated with generalized trust in the same way. So when we had educational selection and generalized trust in the same models, and we were seeing. Yeah, to me that was in some sense the more interesting finding, was that we were seeing that was being replicated in the receiving country as well. So more educated immigrants were not necessarily more trusting, like we were seeing for, in that case, British natives. But again, the issue there is that and I think some people have shown actually that over time immigrants tend to adopt trust that's more like receiving country natives. Other people have done this work. Actually, if you're interested, I can talk to you about that later, or maybe you know it. But yeah, So yeah, that's kind of what we're starting on. But there's also Thomas Sowell has done work like on attitudes towards homosexuality, and Antje Rode on attitudes towards homosexuality, for instance, as well. And they show that immigrants start to become more similar and are also selected on this openness towards attitudes too.
That's really cool. Thank you so much.
Yeah, no problem. Yeah, that'd be great. Yeah, it is interesting.
Hi, thank you very much for your talk. I have a couple thoughts. So I thought it was really interesting that you found fairly minimal effects for selection, particularly in the UK, because we have a sort of exogenous source of variation now that the UK has moved towards a human capital policy in 2021. So I wonder if you have this really great baseline data. I wonder if you're going to see sort of a discontinuity once the criteria change, because it's possible that the selectivity mechanisms are themselves flawed, and that's why you're not seeing huge labor market effects.
Yeah. No, that's a good idea. I mean, because in an earlier version of this talk, I stuck in, where is it? I stuck in like where the point-based system comes in, and again, like, because that's like 2008, you don't see, but now they're getting even like harder, and then they raise the income requirement for the family reunification. Anyways, you know all this, but yes, it will be interesting. You're right, it would be interesting to see, and I'd be, love to
You have these great baseline data, so you're just setting yourself up for the next paper.
That's always just a good thing, yeah.
So I can follow one more?
Yes, please.
Arthur Sweetman at McMaster, he did a paper 10 years ago where he looked at the effect of source country educational quality on earnings, and that might be part of the story here, why you're not seeing huge educational effects.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point. And actually, now I'm saying, just believe me, because I don't have the slides. But so we tried interacting. There's this, I think this is the World Bank did this thing where it was like some kind of measure of educational quality using PISA data, and we interacted that with the selectivity measure to see whether or not, and it didn't, at least in this data, it didn't interact, because you're right, like I thought maybe they're just not very like good systems or whatever. Anyways, but something also to think about doing more about, again, with the other data sets too. Yes, thank you, yeah.
Labor market discrimination.
Yeah.
So you're looking at quality of education, but of course there's discrimination differences depending where people are coming from, right? And so there's data showing that people from more culturally distant countries are more likely to have their education discounted. So couldn't you build that? I mean, you have country of origin, you have region of origin.
No, we
right?
have country of origin.
Do you have country of origin of their education?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. No, so and we are also controlling for whether or not they had their final degree was their terminal degree was in the UK.
What's in the UK?
Because some of them, did finish their education, because they came as students, for instance. But yes, definitely, not my work, but other work definitely shows that where the credential is a big thing. Is a big determinant of whether or not you get returns in the labor market in the UK context.
Right.
100%. But we could do something maybe like what he's suggesting, but not just interacting it with selection, but just having it as a measure in its own right. And in terms of, No, thank you. That makes sense.
To what extent do you think it's the lack of null result or the negative result is really a product of the measurement issue, right? Like, for example, you have percentages. So if we're to take a place that has lower levels of education, even if they have, the highly selected individual may have lower levels of education than people who are from highly educated places that are lowly selected. Not that lowly is a word, to look at it, do you think that those kind of facts are canceling each other out? Yeah, relative may be different depending on where the rest of the distribution is.
So like you're saying like basically like just because those who have like even if they have high relative education, but if their absolute levels are low, it just doesn't matter anymore.
So I always struggle with this absolute versus relative levels of education, and selectivity we're measuring in terms of relative levels of education in the sending community. So if that doesn't necessarily translate into absolute levels of education.
No, you're absolutely right, and so I should have been clear. Like in the models, we are controlling for absolute education, and actually, in this, the only reason why that works is because you have the heterogeneity within the absolute levels, and that's the variation we're exploiting. But actually, the paper with Alessandro, the other one, part of why we don't see an effect on kids' educational attainment is that these bars are much smaller for the parents of the children of immigrants that we have, because we can't observe as many birth cohorts, because it's just like those kids 10 to 15, and so it's like you need this, otherwise it won't work. So you're right, it is like, otherwise it's just the same thing where it's just, it's just absolute. So that's a good point. Yeah. Does that answer?
Thank you very much.
Okay, cool. Thanks.
Yeah, just a clarification question about the relative education thing. So I was thinking like you give us a calculation for your own education where you would be like 82 something, and then I'm looking at that graph and thinking so we have like PhD first year, PhD second year, and above like in the selected, and how much variation? What does that be like? Like, I mean, it's basically all super higher educated individuals, and like whether it's graduate with master's or PhD wouldn't really, matter as much.
No, it's that's the measure's not capturing those differences, and it is weakness because like having a PhD or having a master's is different than having a BA, and again, my 82% would be more like 95% or something if I actually had that fine-grained information. It's just a function of, mostly it's the Barreau-Lee data set, because they cap it at tertiary. And so I can't, I mean I could if I did the work, but I'd have to like look up, what percentage are those little bits to be more precise. But it is an imprecision, absolutely. And depending on which country you're looking at, it's going to be a bigger or smaller problem. And actually, in the UK context, it's a bigger problem because we have a lot of highly educated people. So yeah, exactly, same here, yeah, 100%. So for this country, it's going to be maybe more of a problem, like of unobserved heterogeneity, definitely.
The other thing also, so I work with like relative income and absolute income, right? When I put them together in the model, it's kind of usually just doesn't make sense.
Oh, yeah.
I'm not sure like how it's like that would translate.
It's just because it's collinear, or
yeah.
So that was a little bit what I was trying to say to Kate. So sometimes, and actually, this is also true in the United States because I replicated this with the NLSY. The parents of the kids in NLSY also, like if you do this plot, they're like very wee little bars, because there's actually not much variation. So they're almost measuring the same thing. Honestly, like in the Feliciano paper, I don't know how that wasn't collinear. I don't know why the standard errors didn't blow up. She must have done something to fix it. I'm not exactly sure what. So that's why. It's just because they're measuring too much the same thing. But in this case, they're not because of the heterogeneity of the population.
Makes sense.
No, thanks.
Is there something about the VAs in the Barreau-Lee data set? Is there something about the field? So I have the impression that people from STEM maybe have an easier time getting into the market than, my wife has a journalism degree. It doesn't really translate to any of the markets.
Yeah, that would be cool. No, they don't, and unfortunately, Understanding Society also doesn't ask about your degree, because I'm sure that would be my prior to. Yeah, no.
maybe other.
Yeah.
I was wondering, like, just an idea, like, would it be possible perhaps like to reach out to those like immigration bureaus, like IRCC in Canada, because they have like much more detailed data on what you're trying to. But I'm not sure if that's like possible. Definitely, perhaps not because you're not going to do but I mean, in the UK, perhaps.
Yeah, I mean, using administrative data would be cool. And like some people, but I've not seen academics use it, but they published something called like the migration pathways. The ONS did. They linked migration data with HMRC, like our IRS. And this, you could see like changes over time and also people leaving. But it was very descriptive, and I don't know anyways, I like your idea. It's like just trying to get this stuff is not always so easy.
You could get a co-author on this or something.
Yes. That's the way, yes. Yeah.
I'll go again. Yeah, thank you so much. Just a follow-up on the previous question. One with what you've seen over time with that trust developing. Does it look like very linear and straightforward, or is there kind of like a certain point where that jumps a bit? And then secondly, you mentioned you're looking at South Asian immigrants. Is there like, do you find a lot of differences within the regions, or do you think like, for example, comparing South Asian versus West Asian or Southeast Asian, do you feel it's like decent practice to kind of consider them from those regional aspects, or should I be looking more at country of origin, that kind of?
No, that's a good question. The first one, let me just follow up to make sure I understand. The first one's about seeing a jump. Do you mean like a jump over time since migration, or over some other?
Oh yeah, no, yeah, since like arrival.
Oh yeah.
Like for example, like if I have a measure of how long they've been in the country, should I just kind of consider that like, okay, each year is going to have a similar effect, or do you think after like a decade or something?
That's
I mean, it's
interesting.
a pretty.
I don't know actually. I haven't sort of plotted it in that way. I'm not sure. So yeah, that's like a thought. That's something interesting to think about. I'm sorry, I don't know. Yeah,
No
but yeah, that's interesting. Like yeah, sort of like a time. But then the second one is there's regional, there's even subnational variation, substantial subnational variation. Economists exploit this actually in interesting ways, like linking like whether or not like you were part of like the Habsburg Empire in this time, and it predicts generalized trust like 200 years later. They love these types of exogenous deals. So yeah, but unfortunately. So, I mean, the World Value Survey, sometimes you can do regional analysis, but not always. So,
That's really cool.
yeah, no worries. Yeah.
If you're ever interested in adding Canada as a comparator country, we have some pretty decent data on these things. We have immigrant landing records from 100% of everyone that's come to Canada since 1980.
Wow.
And we have various, selection policies, and there have been all sorts of changes. But more recently, children of immigrants have been added to these data, so you can really look closely at the second generation to see how they're doing based on their parents' selectivity.
Wow.
So that might give some exogenous variation to see how much of that's actually selectivity versus other underlying characteristics.
No, that would be super cool. Yeah, because your data is hard to get at, though. Because I've tried it. Yeah, co-author. All right, yeah.
Any other questions? Going once, going twice, going 3 times. Please join me in thanking Professor and congratulating her for her wonderful work.